On September 11th, 1857, over 100 men, women, and children were brutally slaughtered. Some were shot, some were bludgeoned, and others simply had their throats cut from ear to ear. Their bodies left to rot in the hot desert sun. The victims belonged to a wagon train that had left Arkansas months prior, bound for California. They followed the Cherokee Trail before cutting north till they reached Fort Bridger. And up until that point, things had gone fairly well. They were making good time and figured they'd reach their destination by late fall. Little did they know they were headed straight to their deaths. You see, in order to get to California for Fort Bridger, they would first need to pass through Utah, where, as fate would have it, a war was brewing between the United States government and the Church of Latter-day Saints. A conflict that would ultimately lead to Mormon militiamen and their Paiute allies committing one of the most horrendous atrocities in all of American history. But why? What could have possibly motivated such an attack against a peaceful wagon train? And who gave the command? Was it just a militia leader gone rogue, an attempted robbery gone wrong? Or did the orders come from the top dog himself, Brigham Young? And just how accurate was the massacre's portrayal on the Netflix series American Primeval? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. The Church of Latter-day Saints was officially organized way back in 1830. According to its founder, Joseph Smith, the angel Moroni paid him a visit and declared that he was destined to become a prophet of God. And for the next few years, Smith allegedly received further divine instructions, until eventually in 1827, he discovered a set of gold plates inscribed in a mysterious language. Long story short, Smith claimed to have translated these plates into what's now the Book of Mormons. He quickly developed a large following, and by 1831, he and his flock moved their headquarters from western New York to Kirtland, Ohio. It's there where they'd remain until the financial panic of 1837. Apparently, Smith had founded a bank, and when it went belly up, he had to flee the state to avoid catching a case. The next stop was Missouri, but they had to flee yet again when faced with religious persecution. I don't want to get too far off into the weeds here. I'm just trying to provide the proper context. But basically, the so-called old settlers there in Missouri regarded the Mormons as religious fanatics. Neither side could get along, there was a series of violent encounters, and eventually the governor just sent the entire church packing. Skip ahead to 1839, and the Mormons established the town of Nauvoo up in western Illinois. And for a while, it seemed like they had finally found a place where they could practice their religion in peace. Unfortunately, this tranquility was short-lived. And when Joseph Smith and his brother Hiram were killed by an angry mob in 1844, the church's new leader, charismatic Brigham Young, pointed the flock westward. Per historian Will Bagley, quote, in 1847, Young led the immigrants to the Great Basin and established Salt Lake City. More than 1,000 miles from the Missouri frontier, the valley's isolation met Young's requirements perfectly. Here the saints could build up the kingdom of God, perfect their experiment in theocracy, and prepare for the battles that would soon usher in the millennium. And yeah, by the end of the following year, around 6,000 Mormons had already arrived in what they began calling the New Zion. And by the end of 1848, Brigham Young was formally ordained as Joseph Smith's successor. By the way, just real quick, if you're watching this on YouTube, you may have noticed our new intro. I'd like to give a big shout out to Pierre de la Côte for whipping that up for me. De la Côte. Hope I'm saying that right. Anyway, Pierre is a very talented guy, both in design and filmography. I think he even does a little script writing. So if you're curious to learn more, or maybe you're looking for some help on an upcoming project, head on over to delacote.ca. That's DELACOTE.ca. I'll also drop a link down below. All right, let's get back to it. Now, it's worth noting that when the Mormons first arrived, Utah was not yet a state. Hell, it wasn't even a territory, at least not initially. In fact, it was the lack of this organization that worked out pretty well in the church's favor. Saints were still technically under the protection of the U.S. government, but at the same time, they were far enough away to do their own thing. It wasn't long before Brigham Young began petitioning authorities back east to form a new state he called Deseret. And I gotta hand it to the guy, Young was nothing if not ambitious. In addition to present-day Utah, Deseret was also to include most of Nevada and Arizona, along with parts of California, Oregon, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. Huge swath of territory. Only thing is, the officials over in Washington weren't having it. And yes, there is an R in Washington, okay? Look it up. They would establish the territory of Utah, though, following the Compromise of 1850. It was only about half the size of the proposed state of Deseret, but it was still a pretty hefty chunk of land. And just to sweeten the deal, President Fillmore appointed Brigham Young as the territory's very first governor. And yeah, for the next few years, Young was pretty much free to run the territory as he saw fit, with very little regard to the federal government back east. At least he did until James Buchanan became president in 1857. Like many other elected officials, along with the public at large, Buchanan was just a tad bit unnerved by Young's growing power. He also wasn't very happy about the whole polygamy situation, or what the Mormons referred to as plural marriage. Now, I'm not really going to delve into the church's beliefs. They would eventually ban polygamy in 1890, but back in the mid-19th century, they were definitely all about that whole sister-wife lifestyle. Hell, even their leader, Brigham Young, would have a total of 56 brides over the course of his life. No wonder he lost his damn mind. It's worth noting, however, that not all LDS members practiced polygamy, even in 1857. According to one source, it was only around 20 to 25% who were members of polygamous households, with the practice involving just 1/3 of Mormon women of marrying age. So yeah, not everyone was a practitioner, but it was certainly enough to put them at odds with the folks back east. Most of the politicians on both sides of the aisle condemned polygamy, with many of them going so far as comparing it to slavery. In fact, the newly formed Republican Party pledged to, quote, prohibit in the territories those two twin relics of barbarism, polygamy and slavery. In turn, the Democrats also denounced the practice, mostly because they wanted to separate polygamy from popular sovereignty, or the idea that the state should be able to choose for themselves whether or not to allow slavery. So on one hand, you had people who legitimately felt like the practice was immoral, but at the same time, you had politicians using polygamy as a hot-button topic to either promote or denounce the spread of slavery. And then, of course, you had Brigham Young's particular style of governing. Despite the territory being technically under the umbrella of the U.S. government, he had essentially set up a theocracy. Church doctrine was given precedence when it came to civil affairs, and the saints were urged to use ecclesiastical arbitration to resolve disputes as opposed to relying on the legal system. It didn't take long for the press to pick up on all this. They began printing a ton of stories, both sensationalizing Mormon beliefs and exaggerating claims that the Mormons were antagonizing outsiders. Exaggerated or not, the American public began to view Brigham Young as a tyrant, one who was looking to create his very own polygamous kingdom, basically just a giant cult out in the middle of the desert. Now, despite these growing concerns, there were compromises. And some of the federal officers that Buchanan sent to Utah did initially maintain pretty good relations with the Mormons. Others, though, had a much harder time adjusting, both to Mormon leadership and just the overall culture. And this wasn't necessarily the fault of the Mormons, okay? I want to set that precedent very early on. This is not a Bash the Mormons podcast. Some of those officials from Washington arrived there in Utah with their own preconceived biases. Some weren't qualified for their positions to begin with, and to quote historian Norman Furness, some of them were just downright reprobates. Of course, the Mormon leadership didn't help matters none with their constant resistance to federal oversight, and also their open defiance towards representatives of the U.S. government. You know, it really was an interesting dichotomy. On one hand, the Mormons seemed to be very patriotic. Hell, they even threw elaborate 4th of July celebrations. It wasn't that they hated the United States, so much as they just didn't care for its leadership. Brigham Young summed it up best when he declared, I love the government and the Constitution of the United States, but I do not love the damned rascals that administer the government. End quote, and hell yeah, brother. I'll be honest, I completely agree with Brigham on this one. I too love the United States, but at the same time, I think the clowns over in Washington are the absolute scum of the earth. I think that's true now, and I'm sure it was just as true back in the 1850s. The biggest difference between me and Brigham Young is that I don't think that our current crooks should be replaced by another set of crooks carrying Bibles or the Book of Mormons or any other religious texts. Reminds me of an old saying that when fascism comes to America, they'll be wrapped in a flag and carrying a cross. But yeah, suffice it to say, tensions between the LDS Church and the U.S. government were strained to say the least. A situation further aggravated by a revival in 1856 known as the Mormon Reformation. And don't worry, we are going to get to the massacre here very shortly, I promise. I'm just trying to establish a little backstory, some historical foreplay, if you will, a little history stink finger. Now, it's my understanding that the Reformation was meant to be a period of renewed focus on spirituality, under the direction of Brigham Young, that saw not only a spiritual reformation, but also a structural reformation. Sounds great in theory, but this is also when Young began focusing on a little something known as blood atonement. Per historian Will Bagley, quote, Joseph Smith taught that certain grievous sins put sinners beyond the reach of the atoning blood of Christ. Their only hope was to have their blood shed to atone. Strictly interpreted, the doctrine seems to have applied only to believing Mormons, but it led to the widespread belief that the LDS Church shed the blood of apostates as an atonement for their sins. As the doctrine evolved under Brigham Young, it would have a powerful and confusing influence. Of all the beliefs that laid the foundation of Utah's culture and violence, none would have more devastating consequences. Now, Bagley does point out that modern Mormons insist blood atonement was simply rhetorical and that it was never truly practiced at any point in the church's history. But according to historian Juanita Brooks, who herself was a Mormon, blood atonement was, quote, a literal and terrible reality. Brigham Young advocated and preached it without compromise. And there are actual quotes you can find directly from Brigham Young talking about blood atonement. I guess the general idea was that if someone was considered lost or an unredeemable sinner, the only way you could save their souls from eternal damnation was to go ahead and murder them. Even LDS apostle Jedediah Grant explicitly stated that the church had the, quote, right to kill a sinner to save him when he commits those crimes that can only be atoned for by shedding his blood. We would not kill a man unless we killed him to save him. Church member John Doyle Lee, who you'll be hearing a whole lot more about here very shortly, claimed that blood atonement was designed to, quote, place the priesthood in possession of every secret act and crime that had been committed by a man of the church. And the right thing to do with a sinner who did not repent and obey the counsel was to take the life of the offending party and thus save his everlasting soul. This is called blood atonement. So there you have it. To once again quote historian Will Bagley, eventually the American popular press would attribute almost every murder in Utah to blood atonement. Whatever the doctrine's precise practice, the sermons of Brigham Young and Jedediah Grant helped to inspire their followers to acts of irrational violence. Now, even prior to the Reformation, there were several U.S. officials who fled Utah in fear of their lives. And in the years that followed, these fears would only increase, especially with all that blood atonement rhetoric. Of course, the newspapers also continued to fan the flames with their bold exaggerations. Finally, things got so bad that President Buchanan appointed a guy named Alfred Cumming to replace Brigham Young as Utah's governor. And joining Cumming on his journey west were 2,500 soldiers under the command of General William S. Harney. This was not meant to be a conquering army. They were simply going to Utah to, number one, make sure that Cumming was indeed installed as governor, and number two, just to establish a little law and order. American law and order, not church law. Nobody told Brigham Young, though. He heard about the army just like everybody else through the rumor mill and various newspaper reports. There was a lot more going on during this period. It's very hard just to summarize it all up in one podcast episode, but I like the way historian Paul Andrew Hutton summed it up recently when he wrote the following. Brigham Young felt assailed by enemies from every quarter in the dark winter of 1856 and 1857. Apostates within his own church, which he ruled with absolute unquestioned power as prophet, priest, and revelator, were challenging his authority. Recalcitrant federal officials had fled the territory, claiming their lives to be in danger, and now a 2,500-man federal army was marching westward to enforce federal rule over Utah theocracy. Young struck against enemies, both internal and external, whipping his followers into a religious frenzy with a reformation, with backsliders and apostates to be eliminated by a special army known as the Danites, or Avenging Angels. While Danites burned down Fort Bridger in the Wyoming grasslands to slow the army, others in the south, most notably John D. Lee and Jacob Hamlin, were ordered to ensure that the local Indians would fight alongside their Mormon friends against the American enemy. Into this climate of hate and paranoia blundered the Fancher wagon train. End of quote. So yeah, not exactly the best of situations to be riding into, right? And since the Baker-Fancher party had been on the trail since April, they really weren't aware of any of this. And also, I just want to point out real quick, the wagon train was comprised of several different groups who had teamed up along the trail, okay? It wasn't just the Fancher and Baker families. Although their numbers did fluctuate with people joining and departing at various intervals, It's thought that around 25 families and 40 wagons made up the core of the party, along with several hired hands and around 1,000 head of livestock. Captains John Baker and Alexander Fancher were the leaders, hence historians now referring to them as the Baker-Fancher party. Just thought I'd clear that up. But yeah, like I was saying, they really weren't aware of how bad things had gotten in Utah. They also didn't know about the recent murder of leading LDS apostle Parley Pratt. Now, Mr. Pratt had been on a mission over in Arkansas in May of 1857 when he was killed by the ex-husband of one of his wives. This was nearly a month after the Bakers and Fanchers had already departed. So not only did they have absolutely nothing to do with Pratt's death, they likely didn't even know the man existed. Also, Pratt's killer wasn't even from Arkansas. He tracked Pratt for quite a ways, and Arkansas just so happened to be the place where he finally caught up with him. And besides, neither the Fanchers nor the Bakers or anyone else attached to the wagon train had anything to do with it. Nevertheless, once they got to Salt Lake City, the Mormons were openly hostile, even to the point of levying threats. They also just flat out refused to sell any provisions. Turns out Brigham Young had just held a big shindig commemorating the 10-year anniversary of the church's arrival in Utah. And Young used the opportunity to get everyone fired up over the Army's approach. He gave fiery sermons, not only urging his people to prepare for war, but to also stockpile provisions as opposed to trading with passing wagon trains. So in other words, part of the chilly reception was due to the Mormons legitimately believing that they were being invaded. Guess they figured if they had to go to war with the United States, they would need to hoard as much grain and powder as they possibly could. And then, of course, there were others who really did think that the immigrants were somehow responsible for Pratt's murder, just simply on account of being from Arkansas. There were also a few members of the wagon train from Missouri, so word began circulating they had participated in the Haun's Mill Massacre of 1838 that saw over a dozen Mormons killed. No truth to these claims whatsoever, but the rumors continued to spread. Full disclosure, I'd be remiss if I didn't also mention allegations of the immigrants abusing or otherwise disrespecting the Mormons, pretty much from the moment they arrived in Salt Lake City. Stories abound of them making jokes about the death of church founder Joseph Smith and just constantly insulting LDS members, even to the point of referring to their women as whores. They would allegedly get very angry when the Mormons refused to sell them supplies, so they trampled nearby pastures with their livestock, destroyed fences and gardens, stuff like that. Allegedly. There's even a story about them poisoning a creek just out of pure meanness. But are these allegations true? Could this be the real reason why the Mormons were so upset? Well, we may never know. According to historian Will Bagley, quote, once the Fancher party left Salt Lake, it disappeared into a historical maze built of lies, folklore, popular myth, justifications, and few facts. All information about the immigrants' conduct came from men involved in their murder or its cover-up. Even the immigrant trains following the Arkansans. Arkansans? Is that how you say that? I've never said that before in my life. Even the immigrant trains following the Arkansans relied on secondhand stories told by Mormons, who carefully controlled what they let outlanders see and hear. In light of their origins, all reports of the reckless behavior of a company composed mostly of women and children must be regarded with profound skepticism. End of quote. And look, I don't doubt that there were a few tense moments, and I also don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that certain members of the wagon train lashed out in frustration, especially after not being able to purchase much-needed supplies. I'm just not sure that the disrespect was as profound or widespread as the Mormons of the time would have us believe. And don't worry, we will circle back to these claims later on, especially the stories about the poisoned water. But justified or not, one thing is absolutely certain. The Mormons there in Utah were extremely aggravated at the immigrants from Arkansas. So much so that a few of them even began plotting the party's demise. Now, the wagon train left Salt Lake City on August 5th, 1857, heading south. First to Provo, then to the towns of Nephi, Fillmore, and Cedar City. And at each and every one of these stops, they were once again met with aggression and denied provisions. Finally, in early September, they arrived at a place known as Mountain Meadows, a well-known oasis oftentimes used by travelers along the Old Spanish Trail. To quote author and investigative reporter Sally Denton, it was there where the immigrants believed they would be able to recuperate and regroup, putting the trepidation of the past few weeks behind them. A month of leisurely grazing would fatten the livestock for the ultimate crossing of the desert. They planned on being at their new homes in the land of gold and opportunity by late fall. End of quote. On Sunday, September 6th, they held a church service in a large tent, one they had brought along specifically for that very purpose. Afterwards, the women busied themselves mending clothing and preparing meals as the men gathered firewood and hauled water from a nearby spring. Children played near the wagons and the livestock grazed nearby. Little did they know they were being watched. A guy by the name of John Lee and his militia, along with a sizable contingent of Paiute warriors, were in the hills above, preparing for the bloody task at hand, which we will get to in just a few minutes. I promise. You know, when I first decided to cover Mountain Meadows, I was under the false impression that it would be a relatively short episode. Boy, oh boy, was I wrong. Turns out there were a lot of people involved, many of whom were very high up in the church hierarchy. So my apologies, I do have to give just a little more of a backstory, just so we can properly understand why and how this atrocity occurred. As for the aforementioned John Lee, he first joined the LDS way back in 1838. He was a personal friend of Joseph Smith, and then later on he became the adopted son of Brigham Young. Not because he was an orphan or anything, but apparently the Mormons had a ritual known as the Law of Adoption, where men who held the priesthood were sealed in father-son relationships with other men who weren't part of their official nuclear family. Brigham Young, for example, was sealed by the Law of Adoption to Joseph Smith, and in turn, Young was said to have likewise sealed close to 40 other men, one of whom was John Doyle Lee. Lee did practice polygamy. He'd have a total of 19 wives, and he was also a member of the Danites, aka the Destroying Angels. Basically a fraternal organization who would also serve as sort of a vigilante group. Now, from what I understand, the Danites were no longer operational once the church arrived in Utah. They did have a militia, though, the Nauvoo Legion. And it was members of the Legion who joined John Lee there in the hills surrounding the Mountain Meadows. As to how many there were all total, I'm not really sure. Their numbers fluctuate quite a bit, but a decent guess would be somewhere between 50 to 100, along with another 100 or so Paiute warriors. Speaking of the Paiute, believe it or not, Brigham Young did somewhat attempt to build diplomatic ties with the area's indigenous, for a litany of reasons. You know, part of it was religious. They wanted to convert the Native Americans. Part of it was just common sense, building relationships in order to prevent attacks on the Mormon settlements. And then, of course, later on, it was due to the encroaching federal government. I guess Young figured that the Southern Paiute could serve as allies if they had to go toe-to-toe with the U.S. Army. As to why the Paiute agreed to help the Mormons wipe out an entire wagon train, that's not entirely clear. I can only assume it had something to do with all the livestock. After all, like I said a minute ago, the immigrants were trailing several hundred head of cattle, close to 1,000. They're also said to have had a sizable amount of gold hidden within their wagons. The biggest question, though, at least to me, is how did things get so far out of control from early August, when the wagon train left Salt Lake City, to early September, when they arrived at the Mountain Meadows? What happened in between that led to men plotting their massacre? So here's what we know. Just a couple weeks prior, a ranking member in the LDS, a guy by the name of George A. Smith, conducted a tour of the southern settlements. While there, he paid a visit to John Lee over in the town of Harmony, allegedly passing on orders from Brigham Young himself. To once again quote Sally Denton, many historians believe that Young wrote a letter to his military commanders in the South ordering that the Fancher party be quote-unquote used up. But that letter, like much else, never surfaced. Juanita Brooks fervently contended that Lee would have carried out no orders which he thought would be contrary to the wishes of Brigham Young. There can be no question that Lee took very seriously and literally the instruction from Young's personal emissary, George A. Smith, which may too have been in the form of a letter that has long since disappeared. End of quote. Now, we may not have a letter, but based on Lee's own testimony, he left that meeting with Smith with a very clear understanding of the mission. He stated that Smith was, quote, one of the 12 apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and as such, he was considered by me to be an inspired man. His orders were to me sacred, which I considered it my duty to obey, without questions or hesitations. I will never understand that mentality. The orders, of course, were to attack the wagon train. Skip ahead to early September, just days prior to the massacre, and several Mormon leaders met with Colonel William H. Dame at his home in Parowan, a meeting sometimes referred to as the Tan Bark Council. I think. This is where things get really confusing. just because there's so many different stories floating around, and all of the eyewitnesses were basically just trying to pass the buck and place the blame on others. As of this recording, I have read 2 books and countless articles on the Mountain Meadows Massacre. I've listened to lectures, and I still don't fully comprehend all of the various meetings and messages being passed back and forth, or even who ultimately ordered the massacre, or why. A lot of cover-ups and a lot of contradictions. Either way, like I said, there was a series of meetings among the Mormon leaders south of Salt Lake City, one of which was the Tan Bark Council. I do not have an exact date for when these meetings occurred, other than early September. As for the guy we just mentioned, Colonel William H. Dame, he too was a pretty high-ranking member of the LDS Church. He had previously served in the Territorial Council, and by 1857, he was the head of the Nauvoo Legion there in southwestern Utah. Joining him was Major Isaac C. Haight. Haight had actually been a personal bodyguard to Joseph Smith way back in the day, and was one of the original 50 who scouted Salt Lake for Mormon settlement. He was the first mayor of Cedar City and served alongside William Dame as stake president for Parowan. I never heard of that term before, a stake president, but from what I gather, a stake was just another way of saying a geographical location. So if you were a stake president, you were basically in charge of just a certain area, sort of like a Catholic diocese. In the case of Dame and Haight, that area was present-day Iron County, Utah. In other words, these guys were shot callers. And according to historian Will Bagley, persistent traditions tell that the fate of the immigrants was decided at a meeting at Dame's Woodpile, aka the Tan Bark Council. And per Sally Denton, quote, there were numerous reports that the slaughter was plotted in detail at William Dame's Woodpile in Parowan at the beginning of September. It is widely believed that this group, called the Tan Bark Council, and comprised of Dame, Haight, and an unknown third man, selected Mountain Meadows as the site of the massacre, and that the entire company was to be murdered. A few days later, however, after a lively debate, the conspirators decided to spare the quote-unquote innocent blood of those under the age of 8, over the objection of Haight, who contended there will not be one drop of innocent blood shed, even if every one of the damn pack are killed, end of quote. Another leader who echoed Haight's sentiments that even the youngest of the children should be murdered was Bishop Philip Clinging-Smith. These 2 guys just wanted to kill everybody. Like Denton said, there was a bit of a back and forth, and they finally agreed to send a dispatch to Brigham Young and let him decide. Only thing is, Haight never sent the dispatch. Instead, he dismissed the council and gathered together a new group of men he considered loyal. Bishop Clinging-Smith would later testify that it was during this meeting that they discussed, quote, how to get the Indians to destroy the immigrant party. Haight then sent a message south to deliver orders directly to John Lee. As far as I'm aware, these orders have also been lost to history, but based on what happened next, I think we can come to a somewhat accurate conclusion as to what the orders contained. So just to sum things up, John Lee was given his marching orders from both George Smith and Major Haight. We don't know exactly what those orders were, but they almost certainly involved attacking the Baker-Fancher party. Now, as for the attack itself, that would commence early on the morning of September 11th, 1857, just a couple of days after the wagon train arrived there at the Meadows. According to a survivor, Sarah Baker, quote, while eating breakfast of rabbit and quail, a shot rang out, and one of the children toppled over. More shots followed as the Mormons and Paiutes let loose with their terrible war cries and charged the camp. Within just a few minutes, at least 7 of the men from the train were dead, another 20 or so seriously wounded, including the leaders, Fancher and Baker. Now, if you've ever seen the Netflix series American Primeval, this is the massacre they show on the very first episode. In real life, though, things were quite a bit different. The immigrants were actually able to rally and beat back their attackers. They then circled the wagons and busied themselves digging rifle pits, as both sides just started sniping at one another. Worth noting that the Mormons were also not wearing hoods over their heads, like on American Primeval. That said, though, some of them did paint their faces in order to blend in with their Paiute allies. But yeah, either way, the attack thus far had proven to be a total failure. I guess they were hoping that the Paiute would do all their heavy lifting, but things just did not go as planned. Apparently, one of them had even told the Paiute they were protected by Mormon medicine and that the defenders wouldn't be able to harm them. Well, that obviously wasn't true, as several Paiute warriors were killed in the initial assault. And look, your average Native American is not suicidal, okay? Very rarely would they just blindly charge well-armed and well-dug-in defenders. They also didn't have much of a stomach when it came to prolonged sieges, even when they had the upper hand. So naturally, when the Paiute lost those warriors there at the onslaught, they became very disheartened. And when John Lee insisted they continue attacking the train, many of the Paiute just simply packed up and went home. This would prove to be a constant theme throughout the rest of the siege. And by the time they actually got down to the nut cutting, it's thought that only around 20 to 40 of the Paiute remained. Hell, enough of them called it quits on Monday that Lee had to send a dispatch to Isaac Haight asking for reinforcements. And Haight responded by sending around a dozen or so volunteers. Following afternoon, Lieutenant Schertz arrived with an additional 10 men from the Nauvoo Legion, and they were soon joined by around a half a dozen men from the nearby community of Washington, also spelled with an R. Others began trickling in from Pinto Creek, Cedar City, and pretty much all of the Mormon settlements south of Parowan. Per author Sally Denton, quote, "The siege that began on Monday continued through Tuesday with a half-hearted round of sniper fire. The immigrants listened to the cattle herd bellowing in the distance as the enemy began their roundup. The defenders continued to strengthen the redoubt, but every foray to the spring for fresh water was met with gunfire. The sporadic salvos indicated a strange perseverance amidst a partial retreat, as if the enemy were biding time while it mustered its forces." End of quote. Now, later on Tuesday night, John Lee led another failed raid against the wagons that resulted in even more of the Paiute warriors being killed. This further enraged the Paiute, so Lee once again had to send a messenger to Haight informing him of the recent developments and the general attitude of the indigenous. By the way, I failed to mention this earlier, but Lee was actually what was known as a farmer to the Indians, which, from my very basic understanding, was essentially the Mormon version of an Indian agent. So he did have a relationship with the tribe. And Haight, upon receiving Lee's dispatch, rushed to Parowan to hold council with Colonel William Dame. This is where things get confusing again. There are just so many different stories and very few, if any, reliable eyewitnesses. There are conflicting reports as to who ordered what, but Isaac Haight did finally send off a dispatch to Brigham Young. Meanwhile, the defenders were suffering something fierce. By Wednesday, several of the wounded had expired, and the air was getting thick with the smell of rotten flesh. The lack of food and water was also taking its toll, but they held strong and continued putting up a fierce resistance. There was another failed attack Thursday morning that resulted in at least one Mormon dead and even more of the Paiute calling it quits. But luckily for Lee, reinforcements arrived the following day. That's also when Brigham Young finally received that letter from Isaac Haight. Once again, very little is known. We have no idea what Haight told Brigham, but we do have Young's extremely vague reply. Quote, "In regard to the immigration trains passing through our settlements, we must not interfere with them until they are first notified to keep away. You must not meddle with them. The Indians, we expect, will do as they please. But you should try and persevere good feelings with them. There are no other trains going south that I know of. If those that are there will leave, let them go in peace." End of quote. So there's a few different ways to interpret this. Brigham Young apologists often point to the letter as proof that he didn't order the attack, while others think it was just plausible deniability. Doesn't really matter, though, because the orders wouldn't arrive at the Meadows in time to stop what was coming. Now, there's a lot more involved. John Lee did supposedly receive yet another dispatch from Haight, or at least it was signed by Haight, but allegedly the contents came from Colonel Dame, once again instructing Lee and the militia to kill all of the immigrants except for the children under the age of 8 years old. And look, like I said earlier, this is a very complicated story with a lot of moving parts, as well as a lot of people just covering their asses. Once again, it's almost impossible to sum up this entire massacre within the confines of a single podcast episode. But if you're looking to learn more, I will drop a list of books down in the description. What I do know is that on Thursday evening, Lee and several of his men prayed to the Holy Spirit for guidance, or at least they did, according to Lee. No word on the Almighty's reply, but when a vote was held afterwards, each and every man agreed to kill the immigrants. Lee would later state that he believed, quote, "the Gentiles were to be killed as a war measure, and that the Mormons, as God's chosen people, were to hold and inhabit the earth and govern the globe." So yeah, totally rational thought process. And it was early the next morning, on Friday, September 11th, when Lee put his plan into action. Now, by this point, the immigrants were completely out of food and water. Their leaders were either dead or wounded, and only around 24 of the men were still able to put up a fight. They were also almost out of ammunition. To say that things were getting dire was a bit of an understatement. If help didn't arrive soon, they would all be as good as dead. And that's when they spotted them, a large group of white men in the distance waving a flag. The besieged pioneers began to shout in excitement as their would-be saviors came riding into camp, not knowing that these were the very same men who had been trying to kill them for the past 5 days. Remember, as far as the wagon train was concerned, it was the Indians who were attacking them, not the Mormons. Kind of. It's worth noting that a handful of the immigrants had slipped out of camp in order to fetch help. They were all killed except for one, a guy known only as the Dutchman. He was wounded by the Mormons, but still able to make it back to the wagons before expiring. This story does seem to be somewhat up for debate. I'm not even sure if he actually existed, but if it's true, then it's next to certain that the Dutchman would have warned the others that it was the Mormons and not the Indians who were the real threat. Also, as the wagon train traveled through southern Utah, they had picked up quite a few Mormon apostates, former members who had run afoul of the church. Thought that they too would have warned the immigrants as to how deadly the Mormons truly were. So yeah, there were probably hints that the Mormons might be involved, sure. But like I said, at this point, they were just desperate. They wanted the siege to be over. John Lee would later recall, quote, "As I entered the fortifications, men, women, and children gathered around me in wild consternation. Some felt that the time of their happy deliverance had come, while others, though in deep distress and all in tears, looked upon me with doubt, distrust, and terror." According to historian Paul Andrew Hutton, Lee convinced the immigrants that he was part of a rescue column and that the Paiute had agreed to let him take the survivors to safety if they promised to relinquish their arms. Lee claimed that the warriors just wanted the livestock in the wagons, and that if the survivors were unarmed, then they wouldn't be considered a threat. Sounds crazy, but the immigrants did reluctantly agree to these terms, despite their own leader, Captain Fancher, gasping out a warning to the contrary. Dude was on his deathbed, and he still had sense enough to know that something wasn't right. A survivor would later state, "Our men didn't have much of a choice. It was either stick it out and fight till the last of us were killed or starved, or take Lee up on the proposition, even though it did seem fishy." And hindsight's 2020. These were good family men, farmers and ranchers and the like, not seasoned frontiersmen. Sure, they were wary of the Mormons, but the immediate threat, so far as they knew, were the hostiles. After such a long siege, I can only imagine they were willing to do whatever was needed to get their women and children to safety. And yeah, I guess in that desperate state of mind, they fell prey to Lee's false promises of safe passage. After handing over their guns, the survivors were divided into 3 groups. The youngest of the children, plus a few of the seriously wounded, were loaded into 2 wagons. They left first, but the second bunch consisted of the women and other children, walking a short distance behind. Finally, in the last group, the grown men brought up the rear, walking single file, each of them flanked with an armed Mormon guard. The killers kept up the charade until that first wagon with the small children passed over a hill and out of sight. And that's when a Major John Higbee shouted out an order for the militia to, quote, "Do your duty." And with that, the massacre commenced. The Mormon guard shot the men walking beside them, as the rest of the militia, along with the remaining Paiute, leapt from their hiding spots and began slaughtering the women and children. According to one of the men who participated, most of the killing was over in less than 3 minutes. An exact count is unknown, but somewhere around 120 men, women, and children lay dead. Some were shot, some were bludgeoned, and others just had their throats cut. A few of the women and young girls were reportedly raped before being murdered. According to later testimony, quote, "One young girl sprung from the wounded and dead and fell upon her knees before one of the murderers, a young man who, touched by a momentary compassion, raised her to her feet and declared that he would save her, when his father, one of the leaders in the massacre, and believed by many to have been Lee, stabbed her in the heart in his son's arms." Another eyewitness reports seeing children clinging around the knees of the murderers, begging for mercy and offering themselves up as slaves for life if they were spared, but their throats were cut from ear to ear as an answer to their appeal. 2 other girls were told that they would be spared if they stripped out of their clothes and danced in the nude, which they did. Yet as soon as they were done, they were slaughtered just like everyone else. A survivor would later recall, quote, "You don't forget the horror, and you wouldn't forget it either if you saw your own mother topple over in the wagon beside you, with a big red splotch getting bigger and bigger on the front of her calico dress." Like I mentioned earlier, many of the Mormons who were lying in ambush had painted themselves for war, just like the natives. One of the surviving children, Christopher Fancher, would later state, "My father was killed by Indians. When they washed their faces, they were white men." Speaking of survivors, only 17 of the youngest children had been spared, on account of being what the Mormons considered under the age of innocence. They were taken to a nearby ranch belonging to Jacob Hamlin, and from there they were sent to live with Mormon families around Cedar City. Following the slaughter, Lee and the other militiamen took a blood oath to blame the massacre on the Southern Paiute. They swore to never speak of what they had done and to kill any man who did. They also ransacked the wagons and stripped the bodies of their clothing and valuables. Whatever gold they retrieved was sent to the church treasury in Salt Lake City. The cattle were eventually branded with the church's cross and also delivered to the territorial capital, except for a few that John Lee kept for his own. The weapons were divided amongst the militia, and the wagons were later used by Mormons to haul lead ore from Nevada. I still can't say it. Now, there were supposedly a pair of carriages emblazoned with stags' heads that were personally used by Brigham Young, or at least one of them was. Now, as much as the Mormons tried, this massacre would not remain a secret. There were rumors and murmurings, and finally, nearly 2 years later, a detachment of U.S. soldiers arrived at the Meadows to investigate. And what they saw affected them deeply. Major James Carlton, guy we discussed way back on the series Kit Carson, would describe what he witnessed as follows. The scene of the massacre, even at this late date, was horrible to look upon. Women's hair in detached locks and in masses hung to the sage bushes. Parts of little children's dresses dangled by the shrubbery or lay scattered about. And among these there gleamed, bleached white by the weather, the skulls and other bones of those who had suffered. The soldiers gathered up what they could find and buried them in a mass grave. They then built a 12-foot-tall rock cairn, I think it is, and erected a marker that read, "Here 120 men, women, and children were massacred in cold blood in September 1857. Carlton then placed a wooden cross on the top with an excerpt from the book of Deuteronomy. "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord." Those children that the Mormons had taken were eventually returned, also in 1859, and Brigham Young would have the absolute gall to charge the United States government for their food and lodging. Young would also pay a visit to the Meadows, and upon seeing that cross that Major Carlton erected, allegedly stated, "Vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little." He then held his right arm to the sky as one of his men tossed a rope around the cross and yanked it down. They also destroyed the stone cairn. These motherfuckers, man, what total pieces of shit. Okay, so why wasn't anyone immediately punished? Well, it turns out the folks back east had bigger fish to fry. Although there was a congressional inquiry in 1859, it was soon derailed due to the Civil War. And for the next few years, nobody really gave the Mormons much of a thought. Thankfully, investigations resumed in 1870, mostly due to the confession of Philip Klingensmith. Guess the sons of bitch's conscience got to nagging on him, so he started blabbing. According to him, it was Isaac Haight, William Dame, John Lee, and John Higbee who orchestrated the massacre, and that Haight had received his orders directly from the quote-unquote headquarters. It's worth mentioning that Klingensmith wasn't entirely sure if the headquarters meant Brigham Young, or if it was just a reference to Colonel Dame and the regional headquarters over in Parowan. Arrest warrants were issued for several men. Haight went into hiding and basically spent the rest of his life on the run. As for the others, the prosecution chose not to pursue their cases. Ultimately, it was just one man and one man alone who would be punished. Alleged rapist and killer, John Doyle Lee. It took 2 trials, but eventually he was found guilty of first-degree murder by an all-Mormon jury and sentenced to death. The execution was held at the massacre site on March 23, 1877, via firing squad, about 100 or so yards from that rock cairn. There's actually a photo of Lee sitting on top of his own casket just prior to being put to death. He was blindfolded, and after saying one last prayer, he held both hands above his head and asked that his executioners aim for the center of his heart. Several rifles cracked in unison at exactly 11 a.m., and Lee fell backwards into his coffin, and hopefully straight into hell's warm embrace. Now, although Lee never denied his role, he did make himself out to be sort of a scapegoat. He actually wrote his memoirs as he was awaiting the execution, and according to him, he did not act alone. He said that he had many people helping him, and that he himself didn't actually kill anyone. Wink, wink. and that they were all under the impression they were performing their religious duties. He agreed with Klingensmith that their immediate orders came from both William H. Dame and Isaac Haight. He also implicated George Smith, saying that Smith, quote, did not say one word to me that he wished any immigrants to pass in safety through the territory, but he led me to believe then, as I believe now, that he did want and expected every immigrant to be killed. I have always believed since that day that Smith was visiting southern Utah to prepare the people for the work of exterminating Captain Fancher's train of immigrants. And I now believe that he was sent for that purpose by the direct command of Brigham Young. End of quote, and there you have it. Now, just a real quick tangent, but I've heard people defend Lee based on his full cooperation and even the fact that he didn't beg for mercy, died like a man facing his executioners. I guess they feel like he redeemed himself. And I've also heard from one of Lee's direct descendants. This lady, who shall remain nameless, stated that in order to understand John Lee, it's best to take a look at the complete man, his diaries, his dedication to the LDS Church, and his commitment to Brigham Young. Quote, it's easy to make him an evil man without knowing what created him. He was a very hard man, as the hard times required. End of quote. No offense, but I, Josh, do not share these sentiments. Fuck John Lee. He was a grown man who made a very deliberate choice to take part in the wholesale slaughter of innocent women and children. And then he spent the next 2 decades covering it up. Guy had over 50 children, by the way. So I guess his conscience didn't bother him to the point that he couldn't procreate. It's my opinion that he should have confessed a whole hell of a lot sooner. And he should have followed up his confession by French kissing the double-barreled shotgun. But he didn't. Too much of a goddamn coward. He had balls enough to kill women and children, but he lacked the courage to take his own self out. I do not believe that hard times require men that commit atrocities. In fact, I'd say it's the exact opposite. We need men of moral fortitude who are willing to stand between the innocent and the evil, even if those evil men hold positions of authority. Best case scenario, John Lee was simply following orders, a reluctant sheep doing what he thought was his duty. And at worst, he was a homicidal maniac and a rapist. Either way, I do not think additional context is needed. No offense to any Lee descendants who are out there listening. Look, I don't doubt Lee's devotion or the love he may have had for his family. I'm sure he was very committed not only to Brigham Young, but to the LDS in general. Doesn't matter, though. All that was made completely redundant by his role in the Mountain Meadows Massacre. By the way, John Lee is the great-great-grandfather of U.S. Senator Mike Lee, same guy who's now trying to sell off millions of acres of public land. So I guess you could say that the crazy apple doesn't fall too far from the crazy tree. As for Colonel William H. Dame, he would die of a stroke in 1884. Fuck him, too. By the way, both Dame and Haight would visit the Meadows just days after the massacre, and Dame tried to act like he didn't realize that women and children were actually going to be killed. In turn, Haight basically just berated him in front of everybody, said that if he didn't like the outcome, then he shouldn't have ordered the attack. Per Sally Denton, quote, the verbal exchanges on the killing field that morning would become the subject matter of conflicting affidavits, trial testimonies, diaries, military tribunals, and criminal investigations over the next couple of decades. What was consistent in all contemporaneous accounts was Dame's apparent surprise, remorse, and attempted disavowal, Haight's determination to lay the blame squarely on Dame, and Lee's resolve to portray himself as a scapegoat who merely followed orders. Now, Philip Klingensmith, the guy who got the ball rolling on the investigation, lived the rest of his life in fear of being assassinated. I was not able to determine where or when he died, but I do hope it was a painful death. By the way, Klingensmith tried to justify his actions by saying that he was afraid. Quote, I feared personal violence. I feared I would be killed. I had to obey Haight and his counsel. Yeah, well, you know who else was afraid, Philip? All those children you helped to slaughter, the ones who you starved for a week. You're a grown fucking man. You don't get the luxury of being afraid. You should have taken your medicine, tried to redeem yourself, and died right there at their sides. But you didn't, because you were a coward. Isaac Haight, as I mentioned earlier, spent years on the run and died in Arizona in 1886. If hell really exists, it is my fervent hope that he has a front row seat. So the big question that still remains is whether or not Brigham Young truly ordered the massacre. Apparently John D. Lee thought he did. And historian Will Bagley, whose book Blood of the Prophets I used for a good deal of this episode's research, agrees. According to Mr. Bagley, quote, "After 5 years researching and writing about this horrific atrocity, I doubted I'd ever find a definitive answer to the question, did Brigham Young order the murders at Mountain Meadows? I was wrong. To my surprise, I found evidence that convinced me, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Brigham Young issued orders, probably verbal, to kill everyone in the Fancher party except those of innocent blood, to fulfill his sacred vow to avenge the blood of the prophets, Joseph and Hiram Smith, and more specifically, Apostle Parley P. Pratt. As one of John D. Lee's wives put it, the Mormons were so insulted and indignant over the death of Pratt that they wreaked untold vengeance on the poor immigrants." Bagley then goes on to write that Young did not behave as an innocent man following the massacre, and that his fiery discourses calling for blood and vengeance, his encouragement of Indian attacks on the wagon trains, and the lies that he told to cover up the crime all show that he was intimately involved in fomenting a vicious act of vengeance. He then asserts that Brigham all but admitted to it when he visited the site and said, "Vengeance is mine, and I have taken a little," in addition to also saying that the victims merited their fate. Quote, "Why didn't he use his powers as territorial governor to hunt down the men who committed this despicable crime? Why did he do nothing to return the stolen property? Why did he shield the murderers and allow the church's newspapers to blame the crime on the Paiutes for a dozen years after Jacob Hamlin told him that the Mormons were involved?" There is only one answer to all of these questions. Brigham Young ordered the murders as a righteous act of vengeance. End of quote. That said, historian Ron Walker disagrees. According to Mr. Walker, good history must be based on facts, not theories, not circumstantial evidence, not conspiracies, but facts. Walker points to that letter that Smith sent as proof that he did try to stop the massacre, and that we should take it at face value rather than speculate as to his intentions. Professor Walker also states that there's no credible evidence showing that Young even wanted a massacre. There's a lot of assumptions, but no hard proof. In fact, Walker even points to Young speaking out against revenge killings and saying that justice for his people's wrongs was heaven's responsibility and not his. Walker also mentions that John Lee was repeatedly offered leniency in exchange for incriminating Young, but he refused, saying that Brigham was not a man of violence. Quote, "While the church leader's temper and strong words at the pulpit earned him a reputation for coercion, in truth, those who knew him best often spoke of his caution and his abhorrence of bloodshed. Militia orders to the Mormon army carried Young's words on the reverse, shed no blood. The Mountain Meadows Massacre was a horrible atrocity, and the conduct of some Mormons involved was deplorable. But we only make the tragedy worse by saying that it was something other than what it was, by trying to fit events into a preconceived theory of conspiracy, including charging Brigham Young with crimes that he did not commit." End of quote. So yeah, that's sort of a long way of saying that while Brigham Young certainly appears to be guilty, there's really not much in the way of hard evidence implicating him in the massacre, or at least nothing that proves that he gave the orders. By the way, you can read more about their opinions in the recent May-June 2025 edition of True West magazine. And you know, we may never get to the bottom of it. However, I would argue that, at the very least, it was Young's rhetoric that emboldened Lee and the others, even if he himself didn't personally order the massacre. Remember all that stuff we said earlier about blood atonement? If you were a true believer, then why wouldn't you do as Young said, right? If you felt like you could save someone from eternal damnation by murdering them, then why not do it? Especially if you know that the supreme leader of the church, a man who's considered not only an apostle but a prophet, and thereby has a direct line to God Almighty, says that it's okay. Words have power. It's my opinion that even if Young didn't directly order the attack, I think he probably did, but even if he didn't, he was still responsible on account of all that violent rhetoric. The man spent years preaching fire and brimstone, and eventually, whether it was through his orders or not, his disciples brought hell to earth. They acted as judge, jury, and executioner, all in the name of God. They even had the fucking audacity to hold a prayer meeting the night before the massacre. And as much as these men feared Brigham Young, I seriously doubt they would have attacked that wagon train if they didn't think they had his approval. Now, like I keep mentioning, there's a lot more involved with the story. I feel like I barely scratched the surface with all of the different people involved. I mostly focused on Lee because he's the only one who was held responsible, but there were a lot of other Mormon leaders assisting him. I barely even mentioned John Higbee. He served as a messenger to Dame, and he was also the field commander for the actual massacre itself, when they killed all the women and children. He'd later be elected as mayor of Cedar City, and Brigham Young would appoint him as president of Cedar City's United Order, whatever the hell that is. Higby, too, would go into hiding in 1874, and later stated that the massacre left him, quote, damned, his family scattered, some dead, others grown up, and strangers to him. Good. He would die in 1904, claiming to the end that the Indians made him do it. George Albert Smith also didn't get a lot of attention in today's episode, but he was very high up in the Mormon church. He's the guy who traveled south getting everybody worked up, and there are many who think that it was Smith who gave the initial order to attack the wagon train. He died in Salt Lake City in 1875. And then you had guys like Jacob Hamlin, who helped round up the Paiute and arrange a meeting between them and Brigham Young. Allegedly, it was Hamlin who gave the warriors permission to attack wagon trains along the southern route, and his ranch served as a staging ground of sorts for the massacre. Now, the other question that's left unanswered is why they decided to attack the wagon train to begin with. And I still don't have an answer. There was a guy by the name of Basil Parker, who was a member of another wagon train that arrived in Salt Lake City just days after the Baker-Fancher party left. And according to Parker, quote, Baker's train had insulted their women and had accused Mormons of poisoning the water that had killed some of the immigrant cattle. Parker also noted that Brigham Young was vowing to turn the local natives loose on the wagon train. Quote, I can see that I was in a very close place just at that time, and it can easily be seen that the way they acted with the Baker train, all they wanted was to create a disturbance as an excuse to slaughter the entire train. And I can see the Mormons were cleverly planning a shield for themselves and allowing the Indians to be the public aggressors, and on whom they could throw the blame of the awful crime they intended to commit at Mountain Meadows a few days later. For there is every reason to believe that the Baker party was doomed to destruction before it left Salt Lake City, end of quote. And okay, fine, but I still don't see how a few insults or accusations was enough of a motive to kill over 100 innocent people. Maybe it was anger over the murder of Parley Pratt, but once again, this still doesn't justify the wanton slaughter of women and children who weren't even in Arkansas when Pratt was killed. Others think that robbery was the motive. I mentioned earlier that the wagon train had a large herd of cattle and horses. They also allegedly had around $100,000 in gold hidden among the wagons. It could be that the initial plan was just to steal the cattle, maybe even the gold. But when they put up a fight and potentially noticed that there were white men aiding the Paiute, Lee and Haight and Dame decided just to eliminate the witnesses. Or maybe it was just a mix of all of the above. The insults, the money, the livestock, the anger over Parley Pratt, and the fear over the Army's approach. Tensions were on edge, one thing led to another, and a massacre ensued. One that the Mormon Church would spend years trying to cover up. And at the end of the day, I have no idea if this was a massive conspiracy ordered by Brigham Young, or just a very localized atrocity committed by a handful of his followers and without his approval. But I don't know, man. All that blood atonement talk, along with Young never lifting so much as a finger to bring the killers to justice, that speaks volumes. Now, just a couple of odds and ends before we call it a day. It's worth noting that the immigrants did take the southern route out of Salt Lake City, specifically due to the Mormons recommending it. When Captains Fancher and Baker returned to camp after unsuccessfully attempting to purchase supplies there in Salt Lake City, they were met by a Mormon apostle, Charles C. Rich. And to quote Sally Denton, Rich, a longtime Danite, rode in with an order for them to break up their camp and depart the following day. Animated discussions ensued, during which the captains were persuaded to follow the southern route to the stream-fed Mountain Meadows. There they could refresh their cattle before embarking on the final dangerous crossings of the Mojave after the desert's 120-degree summer temperatures had subsided. So yeah, not only were they planning on killing them, but they were specifically guiding them to the kill zone, even before they left Salt Lake City. This was also before that alleged water poisoning incident. Interestingly enough, George Smith would actually camp near the wagon train in late August at a place called Corn Creek. He had just finished his travels among the southern communities, was on his way back to Salt Lake City with a few of the Paiute chiefs. According to Smith, Alexander Fancher approached his camp inquiring as to whether or not the Paiute posed a threat, to which Smith replied that they did not, so long as the wagon train didn't commit any outrages against them. And according to the Mormons, the immigrants went ahead and did just that very thing, poisoning either a dead oxen or the creek itself, resulting in the deaths of several Native Americans. Maybe. From what I can tell, these claims are pretty much unfounded. The story changes constantly. We don't know if it was a dead animal or if it was the creek or even a nearby spring that was poisoned. Did the poison kill Native Americans, or did it kill Mormon livestock, or did it even really happen? George Davis, a member of the Duke's wagon train that was following the Bakers, said that the poison story was a, quote, fabrication on the part of the Mormons to clear themselves of suspicion and to justify the Indians in murdering that company of immigrants. Davis camped out in that exact same location just 10 days later, and he never heard anything about the poison. Quote, we used the same water, and between 500 and 600 head of our cattle and horses used the same water. Yet we discovered no poison, nor heard anything of it until we got to Parowan. Full disclosure, but there are stories of other wagon trains experiencing a similar phenomenon. A guy named Thomas Flint supposedly lost over a dozen sheep there at Corn Creek, and another party lost a whopping 86 head of livestock. But if I'm not mistaken, all of that was prior to the Bakers and Fanchers even leaving Arkansas. I've also heard that it could have possibly been due to naturally occurring anthrax, or even a poisonous weed of some sort that grew in the valley. Who knows? I do think there's enough evidence to assume that at some point, something there at Corn Creek was probably killing the livestock, but I don't think there's enough evidence to implicate the Baker-Fancher party. Matter of fact, even the Native Americans would deny being poisoned. Indian agent Jacob Forney investigated the rumors and determined it was much ado about nothing, or in his words, too improbable to be true. And historian Josiah Gibbs likewise concluded that the poison stories were nonsense. Quote, in my opinion, bad men for a bad purpose have magnified a natural circumstance for the perpetration of a crime that has no parallel in American history for atrocity. Now, as to the other allegations of bad behavior, once again, I do think there's probably a kernel of truth in there, especially considering that the Mormons refused to sell them supplies. But I don't think it was anywhere near as bad as they claimed. Per Will Bagley in his book Blood of Prophets, quote, would men with families act so recklessly as to provoke people who were known to be intolerant of outsiders? The provocations and harassment the immigrants evidently endured were undoubtedly vexations, but the tales of their supposed atrocities are suspect. None of these stories appeared until at least 15 years after the event supposedly happened. No two witnesses told the same story, and no two tales described a specific incident. Many abuses attributed to the Fancher party were actually committed by other parties years before. The stories, usually based on hearsay, multiplied over the years. There is no evidence to determine whether they had any basis in fact or were popular myths created to justify murder. Southern Utahns certainly believed that the immigrants boasted of shedding the blood of the prophet, but we may never know whether that belief was based on actual statements or propaganda. End of quote. And yeah, I'm not saying they didn't do anything wrong. I'm just saying there's very little in the way of evidence showing that they did. And besides, even if they did swap some insults back and forth or even trample a garden, that still does not justify the murder of women and children. This is really not that hard of a concept to grasp. As for the Southern Paiute, it is my understanding that many modern-day tribal members deny involvement. But I don't know. There does seem to be a lot of evidence that they were at least partially involved. There was a courier that found a journal in the possession of a Paiute war chief that once belonged to the wagon train. And then there was another guy named H.L. Halleck who passed through southern Utah over a year later. He claimed that the Paiute actually showed him where they laid in wait. And I think one of the survivors, a 6-year-old girl, would recall that her mother was killed by an arrow. I doubt many of the Mormons were archers, but hey, you never know. That said, according to Sally Denton in her book, American Massacre, quote, Indian leaders themselves denied involvement, claiming any who participated were hired assassins and renegade mercenaries who had been promised payment in clothing, guns, and cattle by the Mormons. She then goes on to quote Paiute oral tradition, which states that it was the Mormons who killed everyone, including the women and children. And even one of the Mormons, a guy by the name of Nephi Johnson, would later state that while there were Paiute on the scene, it was the white men who did most of the killing. And yeah, that's the Mountain Meadows Massacre in a nutshell. Now, before we call it a day, I do want to say something in regard to the modern LDS Church. I have friends who are Mormons. My own uncle was a Mormon, rest in peace. And I've had neighbors and coworkers who were Mormons. Your mileage may vary, but me personally, I have not had one single negative interaction with these people. They've always been extremely nice, polite, hardworking, and very willing to help others out, even those who are not members of the LDS Church. So like I said earlier, this is not a Bash the Mormons podcast episode. I was raised Southern Baptist, and Lord knows they're not exactly without blemish. Same thing goes for literally every single religion known to mankind. There's always going to be bad actors in any organization, and history can be very complicated. You go back far enough in your family tree, you're going to find an asshole. I guarantee it. All right, and with that, I guess that's about all I've got for today. Thank you so much for listening. Till next time, try not to join a murderous cult out in the middle of the desert, all right? I don't care how good their drugs are or how magical their underwear is. And I shouldn't have to say this, but how about we go ahead and stop committing atrocities just because some asshole in a position of authority thinks it's a good idea? We're here on Earth for a very, very brief period. Why not use that limited amount of time to spread a little joy? Maybe try to stand up for the downtrodden, the sick and the poor, the widows, the orphans, and the disadvantaged. You know, the people that Jesus said we should look out for. These madmen like Brigham Young or George Smith or Isaac Haight, their power is imaginary. They are little people with big egos, and without us backing their play, they have nothing. I think it's about time that we as men start standing up and telling all the modern-day theocrats and would-be dictators to go fuck themselves. And with that, I'll catch y'all next week. Adios.